What you are about to hear should not be in this video. In the cold spring of 1867, in a forgotten valley deep within the Appalachian mountains of western Pennsylvania, a young woman dressed in white walked down the aisle of a small wooden church. The pews were filled with silent witnesses. The groom stood waiting at the altar, his face carved from certainty and ownership. The priest clutched his Bible with trembling hands, and before a single vow could be spoken, before the sacred words could bind her forever to the man who had already claimed her body and her future, something happened inside that chapel that would be erased from every record, every newspaper, every family Bible in the entire region. The church sealed its doors for 3 months. The priest never performed another wedding ceremony until the day he died. The groom's body was never buried in consecrated ground, and his name was scrubbed from the town registry as if he had never existed. What drove a bride to commit an act so unthinkable that an entire religious institution conspired to bury the truth beneath layers of silence and denial? What had been done to her in the months and years before that fateful day? And why did the women of that isolated town, one by one, generation after generation, begin leaving wildflowers at her unmarked grave for decades after her death, never speaking of why, never explaining the ritual to their daughters? This story was hidden deliberately. It was scrubbed from local archives, removed from census records, and never spoken of in official histories. But the truth survived. It survived in letters hidden in attics, in diaries passed down through generations, in confessions whispered to descendants who finally chose to speak. By the end of this video, you will understand why this story was buried so deep, what it reveals about the systematic silence imposed on women in 19th century America, and why the final revelation will change everything you thought you knew about justice, survival, and the terrible price of fighting back. Stay until the very last moment, because the most disturbing truth waits at the end, and it will haunt you long after this video is over. The town was called Hollowell, though you will not find it on any modern map, no matter how carefully you search. It sat in a narrow valley carved by ancient glaciers, surrounded on all sides by dense forests of oak, hemlock, and pine that seemed to swallow sound itself. The only road, leading in or out, was a rutted dirt path that turned to impassable mud every spring, when the snow melted, and froze solid as iron every winter when the temperatures dropped. In 1867, Hollowell had fewer than 400 residents, most of them farmers who worked the thin, rocky soil, coal miners who descended into the darkness beneath the mountains each morning and emerged covered in black dust each evening, and their families, who lived in small wooden houses scattered across the valley floor. There was one general store that sold everything from flour to coffin nails. There was one blacksmith who shod horses and repaired tools. There was one church, built of rough-hewn timber and whitewashed boards, where Pastor Henry Ashford delivered sermons every Sunday to a congregation that attended more out of social obligation than spiritual devotion. And there was one man who owned nearly everything else, whose shadow fell across the entire valley like a permanent eclipse. His name was Silas Whitmore. Silas was 53 years old in that fateful year of 1867. He had inherited his wealth from his father, a ruthless businessman who had acquired vast tracts of land during the early settlement period by methods that no one discussed openly. The elder Whitmore had built the only mill in the valley, and by the time Silas took control of the family holdings, the Whitmore name had become synonymous with power itself. The family owned the mill, they owned the general store, they owned most of the farmland that the farmers only believed they possessed, and they held debt papers on nearly every family in town, debts that could be called in at any moment, debts that hung over heads like executioners' axes. To owe Silas Whitmore money was to owe him your future, and in a valley with no bank, no court, no sheriff, and no outside authority of any kind, Silas Whitmore was the law, the judge, the jury, and when necessary, the executioner. He was a tall man, standing well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill doorways, and a face that appeared carved from the same grey stone as the mountains that surrounded the valley. His eyes were pale blue, the color of winter ice, and they held no warmth, no humor, no mercy. He rarely smiled, and when he did, It was not an expression of happiness, but of satisfaction, the smile of a predator who has cornered its prey. He spoke slowly and deliberately, as if every word cost him something valuable, and he expected full repayment with interest. The people of Hollowell feared him with the kind of fear that becomes so constant it transforms into a way of life. They respected him because they had no choice. They depended on him because he had made sure they would never be able to survive without his permission. That combination of fear, respect, and dependence made him untouchable, made him a god in his own small kingdom, answerable to no one but his own desires. His first wife had died in childbirth 15 years earlier, along with the infant son who might have carried on the Whitmore name. Silas had never remarried. Some whispered that no woman would have him willingly. Others whispered that he preferred the company of the working women who came through the valley on occasion, women who could be paid and dismissed, who made no demands and expected no tenderness. But in the winter of 1866, something changed in Silas Whitmore. Perhaps it was his age, the awareness of mortality creeping closer. Perhaps it was a desire for legacy, for an heir to inherit his empire of debt and fear. Perhaps it was simply boredom, the need for a new possession to claim. Whatever the reason, Silas Whitmore decided he wanted a bride. And in Hollowell, what Silas Whitmore wanted, Silas Whitmore received, regardless of what anyone else might wish. Her name was Clara Wynn. She was 21 years old in that winter of decision, the eldest daughter of a family that had fallen from modest prosperity into complete ruin. Her father, Thomas Wynn, had once been a reasonably successful farmer, owning 40 acres of decent bottomland and a herd of dairy cows that produced milk sold throughout the valley. But a series of disasters had destroyed everything he had built. 3 failed harvests in a row, caused by drought and then by early frost, had depleted his savings. A barn fire one autumn night had killed half his livestock and destroyed his stored grain. And a gambling habit, developed in the desperation of trying to recover his losses, had transformed manageable debt into crushing obligation. By the time Clara turned 20, her family had lost their land, their livestock, their home, and their dignity. The farm had been seized by Silas Whitmore to satisfy debts that had grown far beyond the original amounts through interest and penalties. The family now lived in a 2-room cabin at the very edge of town, a structure so poorly built that wind whistled through the gaps in the walls and rain dripped through the roof. They survived on charity from neighbors who had little to spare, on odd jobs that paid barely enough for bread, and on the meager income that Clara earned as a seamstress, mending clothes for the wealthier families who could afford to hire help. Clara was not beautiful in the way that poets described beauty in their verses about moonlight and roses. Her features were plain and practical, her nose slightly too large, her chin slightly too sharp. Her hands were rough and calloused from years of labor, her skin weathered by sun and wind, her body thin from meals skipped so her younger siblings could eat. But there was something in her stillness, in the way she held herself, even in the worst circumstances, that drew attention and lingered in memory. She did not beg, she did not complain, she did not weep publicly over her family's misfortune. She endured. And that quiet endurance, that refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed lesser spirits, caught the calculating eye of Silas Whitmore and sparked something dark within him. In February of 1866, Silas Whitmore approached Thomas Wynn with a proposal that was not really a proposal at all, but rather a command, dressed in the language of business. They met in the back room of the general store, away from curious eyes and listening ears. Silas laid out his terms with the cold precision of a man discussing the purchase of livestock. He would forgive all debts, every penny that Thomas owed. He would provide the family with a new home, a small but sturdy cottage on a plot of land that would be theirs to keep. He would give them a monthly allowance sufficient for food, clothing, and basic necessities. In exchange, Thomas would give his eldest daughter Clara in marriage to Silas Whitmore. There would be no courtship, no period of acquaintance, no pretense of romance. This was a transaction, pure and simple, a business arrangement that would benefit both parties. Thomas would be freed from his crushing debts, and his family would be saved from destitution. Silas would acquire a young wife to manage his household and, if fortune smiled, provide him with heirs to carry on his name. The terms were clear, final, and non-negotiable. Thomas Wynn accepted them before the sun set that day. He did not ask his daughter's permission. He did not consult her wishes. He did not pause to consider her feelings or her future happiness. In the world of 1866 Appalachia, daughters were assets to be traded when necessary, burdens to be relieved when possible, problems to be solved by whatever means presented themselves. A father's authority over his unmarried daughter was absolute, and that authority included the right to choose her husband, regardless of her own desires. Clara learned of her engagement that same evening, sitting at the rough wooden table in the family's cramped cabin. Her father delivered the news without meeting her eyes, his voice flat and mechanical, reciting the terms as if reading from a legal document. Her mother sat in the corner weeping silently, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles went white. Her younger sister, only 14 years old, stared at the floor, understanding enough to be horrified but not enough to speak. Her younger brothers, still children, looked from face to face in confusion, sensing that something terrible had happened but unable to grasp what it meant. Clara listened to every word without interruption. Did not cry. She did not protest. She did not beg her father to reconsider. She had learned long ago that words changed nothing in Hollowell, that protest was futile against the forces that controlled her world, that survival depended on accepting reality rather than fighting against it. But that night, lying awake in the darkness while her family slept, she made a decision that would take 18 months to execute. She did not know yet what form her resistance would take. She did not have a plan, a weapon, or an ally. She only knew with a certainty that burned cold and steady in her chest that she would not spend her life as Silas Whitmore's property. She would find a way out, or she would die trying. There was no third option. The engagement was announced the following Sunday at church. Pastor Henry Ashford, a nervous man in his 60s who owed his position entirely to Silas Whitmore's patronage and financial support, stood at the pulpit and blessed the upcoming union with words that tasted like ashes in his mouth. He urged the congregation to celebrate the happy news, to rejoice that two families would be joined together in holy matrimony. No one celebrated, no one rejoiced. The women of the congregation exchanged glances heavy with meaning, their eyes saying what their mouths could not. The men stared at their boots, their hats, their calloused hands, anywhere but at the altar where Silas Whitmore sat, with the satisfied expression of a man who has just acquired a particularly fine piece of property. Everyone understood what this marriage meant. Everyone understood the true nature of the transaction that had been made. And everyone understood, with the helpless resignation of people who have lived too long under tyranny, that nothing could be done, that no one would intervene, that the wedding would proceed as planned, regardless of any individual's feelings. Silas sat in the front pew, his face expressionless except for that small, predatory smile, his pale eyes fixed on Clara, where she sat rigid and pale beside her defeated family. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he has just purchased at auction. Satisfied, proprietary, already planning how he will use his new possession. Clara felt that gaze upon her like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, squeezing the breath from her lungs. But she did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on her folded hands, her face a mask of perfect submission, revealing nothing of the cold fire that was beginning to burn within her. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, take a moment now to subscribe, because the stories told here are the ones that history tried to bury, the truths that powerful people wanted forgotten, and you deserve to know what was hidden from you and everyone like you. The 18 months between Clara's engagement and her wedding were a slow descent into a private darkness that no one in Hollowell officially acknowledged, though everyone privately knew. Silas Whitmore was not a patient man, and he did not believe in waiting for ceremonies and legal formalities to claim what he considered rightfully his. Within 2 weeks of the engagement announcement, he began visiting the Wynn cabin regularly, always in the evening hours after dark had fallen, always staying late into the night. The family received strict instructions. When Silas arrived, they were to leave the cabin immediately and not return until morning. Clara's mother would gather the younger children, and walked to a neighbor's house, making excuses about needing to borrow something or return something, her face burning with shame she could not express. Clara's father would disappear to the tavern at the edge of town, drinking away his guilt with whiskey purchased on credit he could never repay. And Clara would be left alone with her future husband in a cabin with thin walls and no locks, no protection, no recourse. What happened during those visits was never spoken of openly. Clara never described the details in the diary she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She never confided in her mother, who could not have helped and would only have suffered more. She never told a single soul the specific nature of her torment. But the changes in her were visible to anyone who cared to look, and many looked though none acknowledged what they saw. She grew thinner, week by week, her dresses hanging loose on a frame that had already been slim. She stopped attending church services, unable to sit in the same building as Silas and the pastor, who had blessed their union. She no longer hummed or sang while she worked at her sewing, sounds that had once filled the cabin with unexpected moments of beauty. Her hands, once steady and precise enough to set the smallest stitches, began to tremble so badly that she sometimes had to set down her needle and wait for the shaking to pass. The women of Hollowell noticed everything. They noticed the bruises that Clara tried desperately to hide beneath long sleeves and high collars, purple and yellow marks that told their own story. They noticed the way she flinched involuntarily when any man approached too quickly, her body reacting to threats her mind had not consciously registered. They noticed the hollow look that had settled into her eyes, the look of someone who has already begun to die inside, who continues breathing only because the body does not know how to stop. They brought her small gifts when they came to pick up their mending, a jar of preserves, a loaf of fresh bread, a length of ribbon for her hair. They touched her hand gently and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, no words that could change her situation or ease her suffering. But no one spoke openly. No one intervened. No one reported anything to anyone, because there was no one to report to, no authority that would listen, no law that would protect a woman from a man who would soon be her husband. Silas Whitmore owned the law in Hollowell. He was the law, and what a man did with his future wife was considered his private business, a matter between them and God, beyond the reach of community interference. The church taught that wives must submit to their husbands. The custom of the region held that a father's authority over his daughter transferred completely to her husband upon marriage. Clara existed in a gap between these two states of submission, belonging fully to no one but subject to everyone, her body and her future treated as commodities to be traded and used. Clara's only refuge during those months of darkness was her work as a seamstress. She continued sewing because she had to, because stopping would mean starvation for her family. She continued mending clothes for the wealthier families, walking to their homes with her basket of supplies, sitting in their kitchens and parlors while she worked. The women who employed her treated her with a mixture of pity, discomfort, and guilty relief. Pity for her obvious suffering, discomfort because her presence reminded them of truths they preferred to ignore, relief because they themselves had escaped such fates, at least so far. It was during one of these visits, in the hot and humid summer of 1866, that Clara met the woman who would change everything. Her name was Margaret Hollis. Margaret was the widow of a coal miner named Samuel Hollis, who had died 3 years earlier when a tunnel collapsed deep beneath the mountain, burying him and 7 other men under tons of rock that were never cleared. She was 45 years old, childless, and lived alone in a small cottage at the very edge of the forest that bordered the valley. Unlike nearly everyone else in Hollowell, Margaret had nothing to lose and therefore nothing to fear. She owed no debts to Silas Whitmore. Her cottage had been built by her husband on land that predated Whitmore's acquisitions, land she owned outright with clear title. She answered to no father, no husband, no male authority of any kind. She survived on a small income from selling herbs, remedies, and poultices to the people of the valley, medicines that the doctor did not provide, and that desperate people sought in their darkest hours. And she had watched, silently and without power to intervene, the quiet tyranny that Silas Whitmore had imposed on the valley for decades. When Clara came to mend a torn curtain that July afternoon, Margaret saw immediately what everyone else had chosen not to see. She saw a young woman being slowly destroyed, methodically broken, systematically erased. She saw the trembling hands, the hollow eyes, the careful way Clara held herself, as if any sudden movement might cause her to shatter into 1,000 pieces. But unlike the other women of Hollowell, Margaret did not look away. She did not pretend not to notice. She did not offer pity wrapped in helpless silence. Instead, she simply made Clara a cup of tea, sat beside her at the worn wooden table, and let her cry without comment or judgment. That afternoon was the first time Clara had cried since her engagement was announced, the first time she had allowed the walls she had built around herself to crack even slightly. Margaret held her hand through it all, saying nothing, demanding nothing, simply being present as a witness to suffering that had been invisible to everyone else. When the tears finally subsided, Margaret looked Clara in the eye and said 5 words that would echo through the months to come. "You do not have to accept this." It was not advice, it was not a plan. It was simply a statement of fact, a reminder that acceptance was a choice rather than an inevitability. Clara returned to her family's cabin that evening with something she had not felt in months, the faintest flicker of hope. Over the following months, Clara began visiting Margaret regularly, always with an excuse that would satisfy any curious observers. A piece of mending to deliver, a remedy to purchase, a recipe to exchange. The two women developed a bond that neither fully understood and neither tried to name. Margaret became the mother that Clara wished she had, the protector she had never known, the witness to her suffering who did not turn away. They spent hours together in Margaret's cottage, talking about everything and nothing, allowing Clara brief respites from the prison her life had become. And slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone, planting seeds that might take years to flower, Margaret began to introduce an idea into Clara's consciousness, an idea that would grow and strengthen until it became a plan, and then a decision, and then an action that would change everything. Margaret never explicitly told Clara what to do. She was too wise for such directness, too aware that Clara needed to arrive at her own conclusions through her own reasoning. Instead, Margaret told stories. She told Clara about women in other towns, other valleys, other times, who had found themselves trapped in impossible situations and had found ways to escape. She told her about a bride in Virginia who had disappeared completely on her wedding night and was never found, despite months of searching, who had simply walked into the wilderness and built a new life under a new name in a place where no one knew her history. She told her about a wife in Ohio whose husband had beaten her regularly for years, until one day she began adding small amounts of a certain powder to his food, amounts too small to cause immediate harm, but enough to gradually weaken him until he simply wasted away, the doctor attributing his death to consumption. She told her about a woman in Kentucky who had waited until her husband was drunk and asleep, then set fire to her own home with him inside, and walked calmly into the night, presenting herself to the authorities the next morning as a grieving widow who had barely escaped with her life. These stories were not instructions. They were not commands. They were possibilities. They were proof that resistance existed, that the walls around women's lives were not as solid as they appeared, that escape was conceivable for those brave or desperate enough to attempt it. Clara listened to these stories with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on Margaret's fire, never commenting, never reacting visibly, never giving any sign that the words were taking root in her mind. But something inside her was shifting slowly and inexorably, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the surface of the earth. The resignation that had settled over her like a burial shroud began to lift, replaced by something harder, colder, more focused. She did not know yet what she would do. She did not have a specific plan, but she knew with increasing certainty that she would do something rather than accept the fate that had been assigned to her, and that knowledge changed everything. The wedding was scheduled for April 14th, 1867, a date chosen by Silas without any consultation with Clara or her family. Spring had come early that year, filling the valley with the smell of thawing earth and new growth, even as patches of snow still lingered in the shadowed places. The roads had turned to mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels. The church had been decorated with wildflowers, picked by the women of the congregation, though none had done so willingly, each bouquet arranged with hands that would rather have been doing anything else. Pastor Ashford had prepared a brief ceremony, the shortest he could make it while still satisfying the basic requirements, anxious to complete his duty and retreat to the safety of his study. Silas Whitmore had ordered a feast to be prepared at his home, a grand display of wealth and power that every family in the valley was expected to attend and admire, a celebration of his triumph that none could escape. Clara spent the morning of her wedding in a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. Her mother helped her dress with trembling hands, weeping quietly throughout, unable to meet her daughter's eyes in the small mirror they shared. Her younger sister braided her hair with fingers that kept slipping, her own reflection pale and frightened. Her father was already at the tavern, having left before dawn, too ashamed and too drunk to face what he had set in motion. The dress was white, simple in design but beautifully constructed, made by Clara herself over the preceding months with all the skill she possessed. It had long sleeves that reached to her wrists, a high collar that covered her throat, and a full skirt that swept the floor and concealed her feet. The fabric was plain cotton, nothing expensive, but Clara had added delicate embroidery around the cuffs and collar, flowers and vines worked in white thread that were barely visible except in certain light. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever made, and she had made it, knowing it would be the last thing she ever wore as Clara Wynn. Beneath the skirt, hidden in a pocket she had sewn into the innermost lining where no one would think to look, Clara carried a small glass vial, no larger than her thumb. The vial contained a clear liquid that Margaret Hollis had given her 3 weeks earlier, pressing it into her palm during one of their final meetings. Margaret had not explained what the liquid was or how it should be used. She had simply looked Clara in the eye, her weathered face serious and sad, and said quietly, "When the moment comes, you will know what to do." Clara had not asked questions. She had tucked the vial into the seam of her dress and never mentioned it again, not to Margaret, not to anyone. It had remained there through the final weeks, a secret weight against her thigh, a reminder that she was not completely powerless, that she still had one choice left to make. The church was full that April afternoon, every pew packed with witnesses, who had been summoned rather than invited. Every family in Hollowell had received word that their presence was expected at the wedding of Silas Whitmore, and no one had dared refuse. The farmers sat in their uncomfortable Sunday clothes, clothes that smelled of cedar chests, and were worn only for weddings and funerals. The miners sat with coal dust still embedded in the creases of their faces and the cracks of their hands, dirt that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. The women clutched. Hymnals they would not open, their eyes downcast, their faces carefully blank. The children who had been brought along sat rigidly still, warned by their parents that any noise or movement would be punished severely. Silas Whitmore stood at the altar, in a black suit that had been tailored specifically for this occasion, his silver watch chain gleaming against his vest, his pale eyes fixed on the closed doors at the back of the church. He looked pleased in the way that a collector looks pleased, when about to add a rare piece to his collection. Beside him stood Pastor Ashford, clutching his Bible with both hands to hide their trembling, his lined face grey with an anxiety he could not fully hide. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the wooden floor, and dust motes floated in the stillness like tiny spirits bearing witness. If you are still watching, leave a comment below with the words, "History buried this, so I know you understand." What this story truly means, and why it matters that someone is finally telling it. The organ began to play, a wheezing sound that emerged from the ancient instrument like the last breath of a dying animal. The doors at the back of the church swung open slowly, creaking on hinges that needed oiling, and Clara Wynn appeared in the doorway, framed by light from outside, alone and unescorted. She had refused her father's arm when he had offered it that morning, in a last attempt at playing his expected role. She had refused any escort at all, any male presence to guide her down the aisle and deliver her into the hands of another man. She would walk this final walk by herself, on her own feet, under her own power. She moved slowly down the aisle, her white dress glowing in the dim interior of the church, her veil covering her face like a shroud. Her steps were measured and deliberate, neither hurrying toward her fate nor dragging against it. Her hands were folded at her waist, still and calm. Her breathing was even and controlled. The congregation watched in absolute silence, not even the rustle of fabric or the creak of pews breaking the stillness. Some of the women wiped their eyes with handkerchiefs, unable to contain their emotions. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, staring at the floor or the ceiling, anywhere but at the bride. Everyone in that church felt that something was wrong, though no one could articulate what. The air itself seemed heavy, with unspoken dread, thick and hard to breathe. Clara reached the altar and took her place beside Silas Whitmore. She did not look at him. She did not look at Pastor Ashford, or at the congregation, or at anyone at all. Her eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the church, beyond the mountains that ringed the valley, beyond everything she had ever known. Her face beneath the thin veil was utterly calm, peaceful almost, the face of someone who has already made their decision, and feels no further doubt. Silas turned to look at her, his pale eyes traveling over her white dress, her covered face, her still hands. He smiled his predator's smile, satisfied with his acquisition, confident in his possession. Pastor Ashford cleared his throat once, twice, then began the ceremony in a voice that quavered and cracked. He spoke the traditional words about love and duty, about the sacred bond between husband and wife, about the blessing of God upon this union. The words echoed, hollowly in the silent church, meaning nothing, convincing no one. Everyone present understood that this was not a love match, not a blessed union, not anything that the sacred language was meant to describe. This was a transaction completed, a purchase finalized, a transfer of ownership from one man to another. The ceremony proceeded through its required stages, the readings, the prayers, the admonitions. The congregation stood when instructed and sat when instructed, mechanical movements, performed without thought or feeling. And finally, inevitably, the ceremony reached the moment that everyone had been waiting for with various degrees of anticipation and dread. The exchange of vows. Pastor Ashford turned to Silas Whitmore and asked him to state his intentions before God and these witnesses. Silas turned to face Clara, his body angled toward hers, his hands clasped before him in a parody of devotion. His eyes were cold, possessive, utterly certain of his right to this woman and everything she represented. He opened his mouth to speak the vows he had rehearsed, the promises of love, honor, and protection that meant nothing but ownership dressed in prettier language. And then Clara moved. It was a small movement at first, almost imperceptible, noticed by no one in the congregation. Her right hand unfolded from its position at her waist. Her fingers slipped beneath the layers of her skirt, finding the hidden pocket with the ease of long practice. Her hand closed around the glass vial that had waited there for 3 weeks, warm now from the heat of her body. In one smooth, swift motion, she withdrew the vial, raised it to chest height, and pulled the cork stopper free with her thumb. Before Silas could react, before Pastor Ashford could cry out, before anyone in the congregation could understand what was happening, Clara threw the contents of the vial directly into Silas Whitmore's face. The liquid struck him across his eyes, his nose, his open mouth. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Silas blinked in confusion, his hands coming up automatically to wipe at the unexpected wetness on his face. A strange smell filled the air, sharp and chemical, wrong. And then the screaming began. The liquid was concentrated lye, a caustic substance used for making soap and cleaning drains, powerful enough to dissolve organic matter on contact. Margaret Hollis had distilled it over many careful hours, concentrating it to a potency far beyond its normal strength. Where it touched skin, it began to burn immediately, eating through the outer layers and continuing deeper. Where it touched eyes, it began destroying tissue that would never regenerate. Silas collapsed to the floor of the altar, his hands clawing at his face, his voice rising into a sound that no one present would ever be able to forget, no matter how many years they lived. It was not quite a scream, and not quite a howl. Something more primal than either, the sound of a human being, experiencing pain beyond anything they had imagined possible. The congregation erupted into chaos. Women screamed and clutched their children. Men leaped to their feet, not knowing what to do or where to go. Pastor Ashford dropped his Bible and stumbled backward, pressing himself against the wall of the church, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Bodies collided in the narrow aisles as people tried simultaneously to flee and to see what had happened. And Clara stood, perfectly still at the center of it all, her empty hands at her sides, her face calm behind her veil, watching the man who had tormented her writhe on the floor of the church he had built with his stolen wealth. The minutes that followed were a blur of confusion, panic, and misdirected effort. Someone ran through the crowd screaming for the doctor, though everyone knew there was little any doctor could do for injuries like these. Others rushed toward Silas and tried to help him, pouring water from the baptismal font over his face, which only served to spread the burning chemical across a wider area and drive it deeper into his flesh. Women pulled their children away from the scene, covering small eyes that had already seen too much. Men shouted contradictory orders that no one followed. The organ player fled her bench and pushed through the crowd toward the door. The flowers that had decorated the altar were trampled under dozens of feet. The carefully arranged pews became obstacles, as people climbed over them in their desperation to escape or approach. Through all of this chaos, Clara Wynn did not move from where she stood. She did not run toward the door that would have offered escape. She did not attempt to hide or blend into the panicking crowd. She did not speak a single word or make a single sound. She simply stood at the altar in her white dress, her veil now pushed back to reveal a face as calm as still water, waiting. It took nearly an hour for the chaos to subside, enough for coherent action. Silas Whitmore was eventually carried out of the church by 6 men and transported to his own home, the finest house in the valley, where he was laid on his bed while the doctor examined the damage. The examination did not take long. The doctor emerged from the bedroom pale and shaken, his hands trembling as he reached for the whiskey that someone offered him. The damage, he reported, was severe and permanent. Silas would survive, but he would never see again. Both, eyes completely destroyed. His face would be permanently scarred, the flesh melted and reformed into something barely recognizable as human. His days of power, of intimidation, of controlling the valley through fear and debt were over. He would spend whatever remained of his life dependent on others for everything, a helpless invalid requiring constant care. Back at the church, Clara had been seized by several of the bolder men and locked in the small storage room behind the altar, a cramped space filled with candles, altar cloths, and the musty smell of disuse. There was no jail in Hollowell, no sheriff's office, no official mechanism for dealing with crime. Justice in the valley had always been whatever Silas Whitmore decided it should be, enforced by his economic power and his willingness to destroy anyone who opposed him. And now Silas Whitmore lay blinded and broken in his bed, unable to decide anything at all, and no one knew what to do next. The hours that followed Clara's act were marked by a silence more oppressive than any storm, heavier than any snowfall that had ever blanketed the valley. The church remained sealed, its doors closed and locked. The congregation dispersed to their homes in small groups, speaking in whispers if they spoke at all, afraid even to name what they had witnessed. Pastor Ashford locked himself in his study at the parsonage and refused to answer his door or respond to any summons, sitting alone in the dark with a bottle of communion, wine and prayers that brought no comfort. The men who had carried Silas to his home took up positions outside his door, standing guard through the long evening and into the night, though they could not have said what exactly they were guarding or against what threat. The women of Hollowell moved through their evening routines mechanically, preparing meals that no one wanted to eat, putting children to bed with stories they could not focus on, lying awake beside husbands who pretended to sleep. And in the small storage room behind the altar of the church, Clara Wynn sat alone in complete darkness, her back against the wall, her wedding dress now stained with dust and candle wax, waiting for whatever would come next with a patience that surprised even herself. She felt no fear. That was the strangest part, the thing she had not expected. She had anticipated terror, panic, regret, the overwhelming horror of realizing what she had done and what consequences she would face. Instead, she felt only a profound and unfamiliar peace. For the first time in 18 months, no one was coming to hurt her. No footsteps would approach the cabin door after dark. No hands would reach for her in the night. No one would claim her body as property to be used. She was locked in a storage room, yes, facing unknown punishment, possibly death. But in this moment, she was free. The future was uncertain, but it was her own. She had taken action, had refused to accept the fate assigned to her, had struck back against the man who had believed himself untouchable. Whatever happened next, that could never be taken from her. She had proven to herself and to the world that even the powerless have choices. Even the trapped can fight. Even the silent can find a way to scream so loudly that history cannot ignore them. She closed her eyes in the darkness and waited, and the waiting was easy because she no longer feared anything that living men could do to her. The town's response to Clara's act revealed more about Hollowell and its true nature than any official record ever could. There was no mob gathering torches and demanding justice. There were no men with ropes seeking a tree from which to hang the would-be bride. The violence that the community had tolerated for so long, when it was directed at women and the powerless, somehow failed to materialize when it would have been directed at a woman who had defended herself against that very violence. Instead, there was silence, confusion, and something that looked almost like relief. The women of Hollowell were particularly quiet in the days that followed. They went about their business with downcast eyes and closed mouths, but they did not condemn Clara. They did not call her a monster or a criminal. They did not gather to demand punishment. Instead, they left food outside the church door, bread still warm from the oven, jars of preserved fruit, pieces of dried meat. They sent clean clothes through their husbands with instructions that they be given to the prisoner. They found reasons to walk past the church multiple times each day, as if keeping watch over something precious. One elderly widow, a woman named Patience Moore, who had known Silas Whitmore's first wife and had attended her funeral, was overheard saying to her neighbor, "She did what had to be done. Someone should have done it years ago." She was not contradicted. The men of the community were more divided, as men often are when violence is committed by those who are not supposed to be capable of violence. Some argued loudly that Clara should be hanged immediately, made an example of, punished with the full severity that her crime against a prominent citizen demanded. Others argued with equal conviction that without Silas to direct them and provide authority, they had no legal standing to execute anyone, that such a decision required proper judicial process. Still others, speaking quietly, and only to those they trusted, completely admitted that Silas Whitmore had earned what he received. They had all seen how he treated his workers, his debtors, his tenants. They had all heard rumors about his visits to the Wynn cabin, rumors that everyone knew were more than rumors. They had all chosen to look away, to remain silent, to accept the arrangement because opposing it would have cost them everything they had. And now they were forced to face the consequences of that collective blindness, the collective cowardice, the collective sin of a community that had sold one of its daughters to a monster and called it business. 3 days after the wedding that never was, a meeting was called at the church to decide Clara's fate. Every man in Hollowell who could walk attended, filling the pews that had so recently held witnesses to her act. Women were not permitted inside the building, but many gathered outside the doors, pressing their ears against the thin wooden walls, listening to every word that passed within. Pastor Ashford presided over the meeting, though he seemed barely capable of coherent speech, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking. The discussion lasted nearly 4 hours, voices rising and falling, arguments clashing, the fundamental conflict of the community laid bare for all to see. Some men demanded death. What she did was attempted murder, they argued. If we let this stand, no man in this valley will be safe. Our wives will think they can do the same to us. There must be consequences. Others demanded mercy. She was driven to it, they countered. Everyone knows what Silas was doing to her. What would any of us do in her position? She was defending herself. Others sought a middle path. Send her away. Exile her from the valley. Let her be someone else's problem. We don't have to kill her, but we don't have to keep her either. The arguments grew heated at times, with men standing and shouting at each other across the church, old grudges and resentments, surfacing alongside the immediate question of Clara's fate. But when the final vote was called, a decision emerged that satisfied no one completely, but offended no one enough to reject. Clara Wynn would not be executed. She would not be imprisoned, as there was no prison, and no one willing to build one for a single prisoner. She would be exiled from Hollowell forever, forbidden ever to return under penalty of death. Her family would be permitted to remain in the valley, though they would carry the shame of her act forever, a burden that would follow them and their descendants for generations. The church would be closed for 3 months, ritually purified according to Pastor Ashford's interpretations of Scripture, and rededicated before any future services could be held, and all records of the wedding would be destroyed. Every announcement, every notation in the church registry, every mention in any official document would be burned or erased. It would be as though the event had never happened, as though Clara Wynn had never walked down that aisle, as though Silas Whitmore had never fallen screaming to the floor. This was not justice. This was erasure. It was the only solution that allowed the town to continue functioning without confronting the deeper truths that Clara's act had forced into the light. Clara was released from the storage room on the morning of the 4th day. The light that streamed through the open door was blinding after so many hours in darkness, and she had to shield her eyes as she stepped out into the church that had been the scene of her crime. The building was empty except for 2 men who had been assigned to escort her out of the valley. They would not meet her eyes. They gave her a small bag containing bread, dried meat, and a handful of coins, provisions barely sufficient for a week of travel. They told her in flat voices that she must leave Hollowell by sundown and never return. She was not permitted to see her family, not permitted to say goodbye to her mother or her siblings, not permitted to gather any possessions from the cabin that had been her home. She was not permitted to speak to anyone. The 2 men walked her to the edge of town, to the place where the dirt road left the valley and disappeared into the forest. They stood and watched as she began walking away from everything she had ever known, her white wedding dress now grey with dust and torn in several places, her feet already aching in shoes not meant for long travel. They watched until she disappeared around the first bend in the road, and then they turned back without a word. Clara walked for hours, putting as much distance between herself and Hollowell as her body could manage. The road was muddy and difficult, sucking at her shoes with every step. The forest pressed close on either side, dark and indifferent to her passage. She had no clear destination, no plan beyond continued movement, no idea what her future might hold. But she walked with her, head high and her back straight, refusing to look behind her, refusing to mourn what she was leaving, refusing to feel anything but the simple satisfaction of still being alive. She stopped that first night in a small clearing beside a stream, drinking cold water from her cupped hands and eating a piece of bread from her meager supplies. She slept sitting up against a tree, her body too tired to fear the noises of the forest, the rustling and calling that filled the darkness. When morning came, she rose and continued walking, and she did not stop until Hollowell and everything it represented was far behind her, until new mountains had risen between her and her past. What happened to Clara Wynn after she left Hollowell remained a complete mystery for over a century. The town's records had been deliberately destroyed. Her family, when they spoke of her at all, claimed not to know where she had gone or what had become of her. Her name became a whispered legend in the valley, a ghost story, told by children to frighten each other, a cautionary tale shared between women in the privacy of their kitchens and sewing circles. Some said she had died in the wilderness, her bones scattered by animals, her grave unmarked and unknown. Others said she had found refuge in another town, living under a false name, always watching over her shoulder for pursuers who never came. Still others claimed she haunted the ruins of the old church, appearing on moonless nights to those who had wronged there, wives seeking vengeance from beyond the grave. But in 1952, a historian named Elizabeth Carey was researching women's lives in 19th century Appalachia when she discovered a collection of letters in the attic of an old farmhouse in Millfield, Ohio. The farmhouse had belonged to a family named Martin, and the letters had been written by a woman named Clara Martin, who had arrived in Millfield in 1868 and had lived there quietly until her death in 1923. The letters revealed a woman of remarkable intelligence, compassion, and emotional resilience, a woman who had built a completely new life from nothing. Clara Martin had arrived in Millfield with no money, no possessions, no references, and no history she was willing to share. She had found work as a seamstress, as she had always done, and had slowly earned the trust of the community through the quality of her work and the quietness of her manner. She had eventually married a schoolteacher named William Martin, a kind and gentle man who never asked about her past and accepted her exactly as she was. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son, all of whom grew into respected members of the community. Clara had lived to see grandchildren born, had maintained a large garden that was the envy of her neighbors, had been known for the medicines and remedies she prepared from herbs she grew and gathered. She was remembered, in the town where she had made her second life, as a gentle and generous woman who listened more than she spoke, and who always seemed to understand the troubles of others without being told. But one letter, written to a distant cousin she trusted, contained a confession that confirmed what Elizabeth Carey had begun to suspect. The letter was dated 1919, when Clara Martin was 73 years old and knew her remaining time was limited. In it, she finally explained why she had done what she did on that April afternoon more than 50 years earlier. She wrote of the months of torment she had endured before her wedding, the violations of her body and her dignity that she had suffered in silence because no one would have helped her even if she had spoken. She wrote of her desperation as the wedding approached, her certainty that marriage would only make her suffering legal and permanent, her conviction that death would be preferable to the life that awaited her. She wrote of Margaret Hollis, the widow who had shown her that resistance was possible, who had given her the weapon without telling her what it was, trusting her to make her own choice. And she wrote of the moment at the altar, when she had looked into Silas Whitmore's pale eyes and seen nothing there but ownership, entitlement, and the absolute certainty that he would control her completely forever. In that moment, she wrote, something had broken free inside her. Not anger exactly, and not hatred, though she supposed both emotions were part of it. Something colder, more fundamental. A refusal that came from the deepest part of her being, a part that had never fully submitted no matter how much her body had suffered. She did not regret what she had done. She would do it again if she found herself in the same circumstances without hesitation. But she had spent the rest of her life trying to become someone worthy of the second chance she had seized through violence. She hoped she had succeeded. She was not certain. She asked her cousin not to judge her too harshly and to understand that sometimes survival requires things we would rather not remember. Silas Whitmore survived for another 12 years after the wedding that destroyed him. He never recovered his sight. He never recovered his power or his ability to intimidate. His vast wealth slowly drained away as tenants stopped paying debts they knew could no longer be enforced, as debtors defaulted without fear of consequences, as the system of control he had built collapsed without his active maintenance. His lands were sold, piece by piece, to pay for his ongoing care, for the nurses and servants who tended to a man who could do nothing for himself. By the time he died in 1879, he was a forgotten man, living in a small cottage that had once been servants' quarters, tended by a single hired nurse who knew nothing of his history and cared nothing for his comfort beyond what she was paid to provide. His death went unnoticed outside the immediate vicinity. His grave was unmarked, as no one cared enough to pay for a headstone. The church he had built was eventually torn down in 1891, replaced with a new structure that bore no resemblance to the original, designed specifically to erase any reminder of what had happened there. Pastor Ashford died in 1872, having never performed another wedding ceremony after Clara's. He spent his final years as a broken man, haunted by his complicity in arranging the union that had led to such horror. The town of Hollowell itself began to decline in the 1880s as the coal mines played out, and the younger generation fled west in search of better opportunities. By 1910, the population had dwindled to fewer than 50 people. By 1920, it was officially abandoned, a ghost town slowly being reclaimed by the forest that had always surrounded it. Today, the valley where Hollowell once stood is covered with second-growth forest so dense that you could walk through it without knowing that anyone had ever lived there. The only visible remnants are a few foundation stones, scattered among the trees, and a rusted iron gate that once marked the entrance to the church cemetery. The graves themselves have been reclaimed by the earth, their markers toppled and overgrown, their occupants anonymous beneath layers of leaves and soil. No historical marker commemorates the events of April 14, 1867. No museum preserves the artifacts of Clara's story. The official history of the region mentions Hollowell only as one of hundreds of small mining towns that flourished briefly during the coal boom and then vanished without a trace. But the story survived. It survived in the letters that Elizabeth Carey discovered in 1952. It survived in the oral traditions passed down through families who had once lived in that valley. It survived in the archives of women's history organizations that have worked to preserve accounts of female resistance throughout American history. And it survives now in this telling because some truths are too important to remain buried. Clara Wynn was not a monster. She was not a madwoman. She was a young woman caught in a system that gave her no legal recourse, no protection, and no voice. Her father sold her to pay a debt, treating her as property rather than as a human being with rights and dignity. Her future husband violated her repeatedly before the wedding, secure in his power and confident that no one would stop him or hold him accountable. The community around her saw her suffering and chose silence, complicity, and willful blindness. In that context, her act at the altar was not simply violence. It was the only language of resistance available to someone who had been denied every other means of communication. The church that sealed its doors and destroyed its records understood this, even if they could not admit it openly. The women who left food outside the storage room understood this. The town that ultimately chose exile over execution understood this. They all knew that Clara had committed an act of terrible violence, but they also knew that terrible violence had been committed against her first. They could not bring themselves to punish her for fighting back against a system they themselves had tolerated and enabled. Their response was not justice, but it was perhaps the closest thing to mercy that their broken system could provide. Margaret Hollis, the widow who had given Clara the weapon, was never suspected of involvement. She continued living in her cottage at the edge of the forest, receiving occasional visits from the women of the valley, offering the same quiet counsel she had always offered. She died peacefully in 1874, leaving her cottage and a modest sum of money to a women's aid society that had recently formed in Pittsburgh. In her will, she included a single sentence that puzzled the lawyers who administered her estate. "I helped one woman save herself," she wrote, "and I would help 1,000 more if I could." The lawyers assumed this referred to some vague, charitable work. They never understood its true meaning, and no one ever told them. Clara Wynn, who became Clara Martin, never returned to Pennsylvania. She lived out her remaining years in Ohio, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her, respected in her community as a woman of wisdom and kindness. She kept her secret until the very end, sharing it only in that single letter to a cousin she trusted. She died in 1923 at the age of 77 and was buried in the Millfield Cemetery under a simple headstone bearing only her name and the dates of her life. But according to her great-granddaughter, interviewed by Elizabeth Carey in 1957, wildflowers appeared on that grave every April 14th for decades after her death. No one knew who left them. No one ever saw anyone placing them. They simply appeared, year after year, until memory faded, and even the granddaughters who might have understood were gone. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth that others could not face. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly follows these stories to their darkest conclusions. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think about the silences in our own time, take a moment to leave a like. It costs you nothing, but it means everything for these stories to continue being told. And if you know someone who needs to hear stories like this, someone who believes that history has nothing left to teach us about power and survival and resistance, share this video with them. The truth deserves to be known, the buried deserve to be remembered, and the silence that protected men like Silas Whitmore for centuries, the silence that still protects their descendants today, deserves to be broken again and again until no one can pretend they did not know. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. There are more stories waiting in the darkness, more secrets buried beneath respectable histories, more truths that powerful people wanted forgotten forever. I will keep telling them, as long as there is someone willing to listen.